Thank you. Vielen Dank. I'm really excited to be here talking about my new book, Powerarchy. This is the first time I'm talking about Powerarchy here in Berlin, which is my home now, where I have been living for the past 5.5 years. Not long enough to speak perfect Deutsch, unfortunately, but that might never happen. But I'm really excited, and we also have books here. The book is not published yet. It's going to be published in 1 week, but we have books here today that I'll sign in the little tent next to this tent after this talk, and we're able to sell them for a reduced price too. So before I talk about what Powerarchy is or explain what Powerarchy is, I'd like to share some examples of what it looks like. And I want to start with a quote from somebody you probably have heard of. I know some of you might not be able to see the screen, so I'm going to read this out. The quote says, "We could understand our people not being classified with whites, but to be placed on the same level as the natives," these are people of color, here we go, "seem too much to put up with. Natives are, as a rule, uncivilized. They are troublesome, very dirty, and live like animals. We are infinitely superior to natives." So I'd like to have you guess, who do you think said this? Well, if you guessed Gandhi, you guessed correctly. And now I'm going to share another example with you. I'd like you to imagine the following scenario. Can you all see these images okay? Okay. So Joe and Brenda are students, and they're also a couple. And Brenda tells Joe that she is excited because she just got a B+ on her exam. And Joe says, "Well, what are you so excited about? It's not like you got an A." To which Brenda replies, "Well, at least I didn't get a C in my English final exam." And then Joe replies, "Well, at least I didn't fail out of statistics," and on it goes. Does this sound familiar to you? A little bit? Have you seen this happen before? Have you experienced something like this before? So my question for you is, why are people who care about each other nevertheless hurting each other? Here's another example of Powerarchy. Now imagine, some of you have heard this example before. A lot of you here are vegans, but I am guessing not all of you are vegans. So imagine that you're at a dinner party, and it's a non-vegan dinner party, and people are eating beef stew. The non-vegans are eating beef stew. And then when they ask the host for her recipe, she replies that the secret is in the meat. You need to use well-seasoned golden retriever meat. Now, how do you imagine the non-vegans would react? Yeah, you get a sense of where I'm going with this. And here's one final example for you of Powerarchy. Now, this is an example that comes from the book called The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. Michael Singer says in his book to imagine that you have a roommate, and this roommate follows you around everywhere you go, sharing an incessant stream of mostly negative commentary on everything you think and everything you experience. They criticize your choices. They tell you all the reasons you should be constantly worried. They call you lazy. They call you stupid. They put you down. They tell you you're not good enough and you probably never would be. Now think about how you would feel if you had this roommate following you wherever you would go. Michael Singer says, well, this is the voice in our head that we all have, that's always there. He calls this our inner roommate. The voice in our head that follows us wherever we go, sharing a judgmental stream of commentary. Can you relate to this a little bit? Probably just about everybody here knows exactly what I'm talking about. Now, these examples may all look like different situations, and in some ways they are. But they all have a common denominator. Take a moment and think about it. What do you think this common denominator is? All of these situations reflect relationships. The relationship between Gandhi or the Indians and the natives, the relationship between the students, the relationship between the meat consumer and the animal who was killed for that meat, the relationship between you and yourself. In particular, they reflect a particular way of relating. That reflects a particular mentality. Now, to help explain this mentality, this idea, I'd like you to think of a relationship in your life, a relationship that you would consider a really good relationship, maybe a great relationship. Now, think about how you feel in that relationship. How does that relationship make you feel? In particular, think about your sense of connection. Do you feel connected with this person in this relationship? And I'm not just talking about romantic relationships. I'm talking about any kind of relationship. Now, think about your sense of dignity. This is your sense of inherent worth, that you are a worthy being on this planet. In this relationship, do you feel worthy? Do you feel like this person sees you as a valuable individual, as having inherent worth? And now think about the behavior of the person you're in a relationship with. Would you say that their behavior reflects integrity? Meaning, do they interact with you in a way that reflects the core moral values of compassion, which is caring, and justice, which is fairness? Do they practice integrity toward you? And my final question for you to consider is it easier for you or challenging for you to feel like you can be your better self? Do you feel empowered in this relationship? Do you feel like you have to work to be a person you like, or does that come more easily to you in this relationship? And now I'd like you to think about a relationship with somebody that you consider not a good relationship. Maybe this relationship already ended. Maybe it's with somebody you've only met online, like an internet troll. You all know what I'm talking about. Now think about how you feel in that relationship. Do you feel connected with this individual, or do you feel disconnected from them? Do you feel that they honor your dignity, your worth? Do you feel like they harm your dignity? They perceive you and treat you as though you're less than. Do they practice integrity to you? Do you feel like you have to really try hard to be your better self and you don't really like who you are so much when you interact with them? You all know what I'm talking about because you've all experienced this over and over and again, these different types of relationships. Basically, each of these relationships falls on a different side of the relational spectrum. All relationships and all interactions, which really are just mini relationships, can be more or less healthy or unhealthy, functional or dysfunctional. They can be non-relational, which is the negative relationship I was talking about, or they can be relational, which is a healthy relationship. Ultimately, relationships that we have can cause us to feel more connected or disconnected. Make sense so far? You're doing a great job in this heat, I have to tell you. Thank you. It's easier for me at the moment. We also know that humans and other animals are in fact hardwired for connection. We naturally seek connection, and we naturally try to avoid the pain of disconnection. Think about your own life. You can see in the pattern of your life. We seek meaningful connection with others, and we try to avoid the pain of disconnection. We also know, research also shows us that humans and some other animals are wired to feel empathy for others, and that feeling empathy tends to increase the ways that will enhance connection. And we know that healthy relational behaviors are fundamental to the well-being of individuals and societies. We know all of this. It's already been researched. We're living it all the time ourselves. And yet, when you look at the world, you can see that non-relational ways of being prevail. In many ways, they are the norm. So the question for us now is, what is getting in the way of us relating the way that we need to and the way that we want to? What is causing this relational paradox whereby we create the very thing we are trying to avoid? Now, I have been pondering this question for a very long time. In fact, my mother told me that I was born old. And this wasn't a compliment when she said it. But seriously, I've been thinking about this. The catalyst for me to ponder this question was an experience I had a very long time ago on my father's fishing boat, actually, which is why my father, the Republican fisherman, actually blames himself for the fact that I became an activist. What happened was that we were on my father's fishing boat, which was my favorite place in the world to be at the time, and I caught my first fish. And my parents were so excited when my little fishing pole finally became taut. The string finally became taut, and they were helping me reel the fish in, and they were celebrating this catch with me. And I didn't feel happy. I watched this beautiful blackfish come out of the water and flap back and forth at the end of the hook trying to get off of it. And then I watched her or him sitting in a bucket with other fish that my father had already caught, basically suffocating to death. I couldn't share in my parents' celebration. And I didn't know what was happening to me at the time. But my father's boat, which had once been such a source of happiness to me, became a source of distress. I ended up not being able to actually go back on that boat as long as my father was catching fish. And seafood, which had been my favorite food at the time, sickened me to the point where I would vomit just at the smell of it. And this is actually still a problem for me today. Even seaweed makes me sick. My young brain couldn't process what I was actually experiencing. I couldn't reconcile or understand how caring people could harm others and not see or feel troubled by this contradiction. And they were my parents, nonetheless. My parents had instilled in me a strong commitment to practicing the golden rule, to treating others the way I would want to be treated. And of course, this applied to other animals as well as to other humans. In fact, my dog was seen and treated like a family member, like a brother to me. And everywhere I turned, I witnessed the violation of this principle, not only toward animals, but toward humans. For example, in the 1970s, as a child who was raised by a single mother who had a limited salary so that we had to get food stamps to pay for our school lunches, my brother and I, and we could never afford new clothes, so we always wore used clothes that never fit us properly. This made me a prime target for bullies who used to taunt me and chase me and call me poor and disgusting. And as a young woman growing up in the 1980s, I was constantly, pretty much on a daily basis, harassed by men who would tell me all of the sexual things they wanted to, quote, treat me to, and then call me a bitch, or worse, when I ignored them to try to manage my anxiety. I mean, harassment in many forms was just a very normal part of life back then, as it is for many people today. So these experiences and more led me to ponder this relational paradox. But it took something extreme for me to start actively seeking answers to it. And as it turned out, it was another encounter with an animal, this time in the form of a hamburger. And it was 1989, and I ate a hamburger that was contaminated with a very dangerous bacteria that caused me to end up in the hospital on intravenous antibiotics, extremely sick. And after that point, I could never eat meat again, not because I felt some, at least not consciously, ethical motivation, but I was just too disgusted to actually eat the thing that had made me so sick. And so I started looking for information about my new diet, which was vegetarian and shortly thereafter vegan. And what I learned shocked and horrified me. I learned about what's happening to the animals and to the environment, and in later years what was happening to my body as a consumer of these products. But what shocked me perhaps even more was that nobody I talked to about what I learned was willing to hear what I had to say. They would tell me things like, "Don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal." Or they would call me a crazy vegan hippie propagandist. You've never heard this before, right? Any of this, right? So again, I couldn't understand what was going on with the world. I couldn't understand how caring people like myself, rational people like myself, could just turn away from atrocities. Why did these people resist the very information that would enable them to act on their caring, that would enable them to foster more meaningful connections inside themselves and with others? So seeking answers, I enrolled in a doctoral program in psychology, and I focused on the psychology of violence and nonviolence, but I wrote my thesis on the psychology of eating animals. And this is the thesis that led to the publication of my best-selling book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. But my research actually led me to discover something that's far broader than just the psychology of eating animals. I identified some of the psychological mechanisms, the mentality that drives all oppression and abuse, as well as how that mentality informs and is informed by external social structures. I had sort of a blueprint with which to understand the deeper psychological drivers of oppression and abuse. Now, just to differentiate oppression and abuse, the mentality that drives oppression and abuse is the same. Oppression is the term that we use when we're talking about abuse on a larger scale, and that's institutionalized, supported by all of the major social institutions. Abuse is when it happens on a smaller scale and is not institutionalized. So usually when oppression is examined by scholars or by activists, it's through the lens of economics or of politics or of philosophy or of sociology, and of course these lenses matter. They each help us see a different aspect of oppression. But we also need to look at oppression through the lens of relationships. Because what my research and the research of others that I've built on has shown is that on a deeper level, oppression is in fact a relational phenomenon. In other words, oppression reflects and reinforces relational dysfunction. This is a dysfunction in how we relate to others, as social groups, as individuals, as humans relating to animals or the environment, and even as people relating to ourselves. What this means, and this is really the one thing if you forget everything else I talked about here, what this means is that unless we change the way we relate, we won't end oppression. We need to change the way we relate. Now, I realize that this oppressive, non-relational mentality is based on a core belief. The belief in a hierarchy of moral worth, that some individuals or groups are more worthy of moral consideration. Basically, that means of being treated with integrity or respect than others. So, for example, just think about Gandhi's statement. Gandhi only argued that the natives should be treated differently than the Indians because he believed on some level that the natives were less worthy of moral consideration, that they were morally inferior. And I realized that this mentality doesn't exist in a vacuum. When so many individuals have the same belief, it means that it is very likely the product of a widespread belief system. For example, the belief that males, men and boys, are more worthy of moral consideration than girls and women or females is the product of the widespread belief system of sexism. The belief that humans are morally superior to other animals is the result of the widespread belief system of speciesism. These beliefs do not exist in a vacuum. And so I therefore came to identify the belief system that I call Powerarchy. Powerarchy is a non-relational belief system that's based on a hierarchy of moral worth. And as its name suggests, it is organized around exercising power over others. What this means is that we learn to derive our sense of power and our sense of worth, our value, from having more than others, from taking power from others or from wielding power over others. The example of the students I shared is a perfect example of this. Think about your own experiences. Think about your own life. When somebody puts you down, when you feel somehow like you're less than, when you feel like you don't have enough power, chances are your tendency is to look for somebody who has even less than you, to look for somebody to compare yourself with, for example, so you can feel better about yourself. We all do this. Can you relate to this a little bit? And when we seek to have more power than others, we inevitably create power imbalances between us. Think about this. When we take power, we increase our power and decrease the power of others. In fact, Powerarchy is structured to maintain unjust power imbalances. And I say unjust because I am not talking about the natural power imbalance between, for example, a parent and a child. So think, for example, of the social power imbalance between men and people of other genders and women, or between humans and non-human animals, or between an abusive partner and an abused partner. In all of these situations, there is an unjust power imbalance. One individual or group has more power than another, and often wields power over them and grows the gap in power. Now, of course, most people would not willingly support powerarchy. It runs counter to our core values of compassion and justice, and, as I've been saying, it creates the very outcomes that we want to avoid. We want meaningful connections. We want to feel good about ourselves and how we live our lives. So powerarchy needs to use defense mechanisms. These are psychological defenses, so that we act against our natural drive to connect without realizing what we're doing. And powerarchy uses two kinds of defense mechanisms. It uses myths, which are stories that are not true, that we learn to believe, and feeds our tendency to exercise power over others. And it uses privileges, which are advantages that are given to some and denied to others, that makes it difficult or impossible to ever close the power gap. So myths are stories like the story that male dominance is normal, natural, and necessary, or heterosexual supremacy is normal, natural, and necessary, or eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary, or exercising control and power in a relationship is normal, natural, and necessary. And these myths disconnect us from our empathy when we are in a position of power. So you can probably, many of you here who are vegan or vegetarian, can probably easily recognize this when it comes to eating animals. Human meat consumers, they are eating animals, are disconnected from their natural empathy for the animals. So these myths disconnect us from the empathy that would prevent us from wielding power over others when we have power. These myths also disconnect us from our anger when we are in a position of less power. Think about this. You've all lived this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I'm probably just saying it in a different way. So, for example, when somebody is in a relationship, a power over or a powerarchical relationship, they don't feel the natural anger they normally would when they're being abused or being mistreated, because they don't perceive themselves as being abused or mistreated. They think, I'm just not good enough. I just have to try harder. I'm making a big deal out of nothing. Instead of anger, they often feel another emotion. Does anyone know what that is? Shame, exactly. So these myths create a feeling of shame rather than anger when we're in a position of less power, which helps to keep powerarchy alive, because people who feel shame feel morally inferior. We blame ourselves for the situation that we're in. We lose connection with our healthy anger, which is a normal, healthy, emotional response to injustice. Privileges are advantages, as I said, that are given to some but are denied to others. So, for example, a powerarchical privilege is that men can run for political office without having their gender be the focus of their platform. They can walk in public with a lot less fear of harassment. People who identify or are seen as heterosexual, quote unquote, can marry. In many places in the world, they still cannot. Can live without being diagnosed as mentally ill. Can start a family without having to justify these decisions. Humans can own, buy, sell, and eat other animals. And an abusive partner generally can do or say whatever they want without having to justify their behavior. And all forms of oppression share these same features, whether it's patriarchy, speciesism, ageism, classism, carnivism, ableism, racism, or so on. All of these systems are structured the same way. The content changes. Who is being oppressed and who is doing the oppressing? The content may change, but the process, how oppression is being carried out, the mentality of oppression stays the same. It can be helpful to think of powerarchy or oppressions as spokes on a wheel, with powerarchy as sort of the hub, the center of that wheel. Powerarchy is like the meta system or the overarching system of oppression that informs all oppressions. And it exists across all three relational dimensions: the social dimension, interpersonal and how we interact with others, intrapersonal, how we interact with ourselves, and it informs how we relate to other animals and also to the environment. I just want to thank you and congratulate you for staying so focused in this heat. I'm very impressed and very grateful. Now, of course, some forms of oppression inform others. So, for example, sexism, heterosexism, and genderism are all informed by, or they all stem from, the broader system of patriarchy. Just like anti-Semitism stems from the broader system of racism, carnism stems from the broader system of speciesism. And sometimes oppressions intersect with one another. That means they come together to create distinct new social categories. So, for example, you can be a woman and a person of color, and the new category would be a woman of color. This is what intersectionality, which some of you may have heard about here, right, focuses on. And although it is absolutely essential to become aware of the various forms and expressions of oppression, it is not enough to just determine who is oppressing whom. We need to also look at why and how we oppress. Specifically, we need to examine the deeper relational processes or attitude that drives oppression and the social structures that reflect and reinforce these processes. It can be helpful to think of powerarchy as an entity, right? As like a being, an entity. This mentality is an entity that's taken up residence in your psyche. And this entity has a survival instinct. It wants to stay alive. To keep itself alive, it needs you to find a morally inferior other. And powerarchy, no matter how well-intentioned you may be, powerarchy will try to trick you into creating this other. This is just the tendency we all have. We are constantly looking for someone who we perceive as somehow less than. The justification du jour is that we're morally outraged, right? As long as we are morally outraged, as we've judged somebody for doing something that we consider ethical, we believe that this gives us the right to harm their dignity, to perceive them as morally inferior and not to treat them, practice integrity toward them. So it's really important to recognize that the hierarchy of moral worth is a myth. It's a massive, very destructive myth. Each one of us is simply the product of the hard wiring, the brains and body that we have been born with, and every single experience we have had throughout our lives, every moment of our lives. We are nothing more nor less than this. I have very little doubt, no doubt actually, that if I had been born into the body and environment of Ted Bundy, the serial killer, I would not have grown into a person who writes and talks about practicing compassion. Really, to feel compassion and to advocate compassion is a privilege. This does not mean that we should not hold people accountable and work to change problematic behaviors. Of course we need to do that. It simply means that in the process of working to change the world, we do not use the very mentality and tools that we are and attitudes that we're trying to transform. We can hold people accountable without perceiving them as morally inferior. And it's also important to appreciate that powerarchy is contagious. Proponents of nonviolent social change have long argued that if we use violence to fight violence, we will just end up with more of the same. And this is not an abstraction, some philosophical notion. This is actually supported by science. Studies have shown that when people feel that their dignity is harmed, when we feel that somebody perceives us as less than, we become defensive. And when we become defensive, we actually are less able to think rationally, and we're less connected with our empathy. When we treat somebody powerarchically, we increase the chances that they will shut down to our message, even if we are promoting compassion, and become defensive. Studies have also shown that when a person is treated powerarchically, is treated with power over behaviors, they are more likely to react with power over as well. Not only toward the person who's exercising power over them, but toward others. So, for example, if you use power over toward somebody else, that person later in the day is more likely to use power over towards somebody else. So powerarchy is contagious. Some researchers have said that this behavior and attitude, it spreads like the common cold. On top of that, when people have power, studies have shown that we automatically think and act powerarchically. When you are in a position of power, maybe it's when you're in a boss relating to your staff, or you're a white person relating to a person of color, you automatically are less connected with your empathy for those others. You automatically feel entitled to break the rules when you wouldn't allow them to break the rules. You automatically think and act powerarchically. So powerarchy is contagious and it's everywhere. Consider how systems that were created to challenge powerarchy, like some social justice movements, can actually start becoming mini powerarchies as more and more proponents use powerarchy to show that powerarchy is wrong. Have you seen this happen before? You open up your Facebook feed and you'll see it all over the place. So many of us are working toward change on the level of content. We're working toward justice and compassion, but we're doing so in a way that is unjust and uncompassionate. When we flip the ladder of powerarchy, we just end up with more of the same. So what then is the solution to powerarchy? I wish it were a simple one-step solution, but it's not that simple. But hopefully it will be simple enough to understand. So since the problem is caused by non-relational ways of being, the solution needs to be focused on cultivating healthy relationality. In other words, we need to develop what I call relational literacy. Relational literacy is the understanding of an ability to relate in a healthful way. Unfortunately, we're living in sort of like the relational dark ages. mean, if you think about it, most of us, I've said this before and I will say it again, most of us have to learn complicated geometry that we will probably never need to use. And yet we don't get a single lesson on how to be healthy relational beings. And when you think about the most serious problems in the world, these are not problems that exist because people don't know how to do geometry. We haven't been given the lessons, we haven't been given the tools and how to relate healthfully. But the good news is that the information is out there. If each one of us committed as much time to developing our own relational literacy as we might to finding out which vegan isn't vegan enough, we could change the vegan movement in no time. So there are lots of resources, and I'm going to give you just a few tips today. I feel so strongly that developing relational literacy is fundamental to social transformation that I wrote a whole book on it. And it's called Getting Relationships Right. It will come out in January. One simple thing to do right now, one simple practice right now, is simply ask yourself, pause throughout an interaction, pause before interacting, pause before hitting send when you're writing an email. Ask yourself, does my behavior, does what I am saying right now, does it reflect integrity? Am I practicing compassion toward this person or justice? Maybe it doesn't because you don't feel safe enough to be open with the person. That's okay. Don't send the email if you can avoid it. And ask yourself, does this person's behavior toward me, does it reflect integrity? Is it honoring my dignity? Notice when you're in a situation how you feel in a relationship. You know everything that I have said here today, you already know because you have lived this every moment of your lives. It's just a matter of becoming conscious of it and starting to pay attention to it. Developing relational literacy includes developing self-awareness. Self-awareness is critical because when we're more self-aware, we are less likely to get hijacked by our emotions and be reactive and hit back and act powerarchical before we pause and decide how we want to respond to somebody else, to ourselves. In particular, self-awareness helps you to start noticing how you're feeling. Notice specifically whether you're feeling contempt or whether you're feeling shame. Or when you're feeling contempt and shame. Contempt is a little bit tricky because it doesn't have a direct equivalent to translate it out of English. But contempt, basically, you feel contempt when you feel morally superior to somebody else, when you're feeling judgmental of somebody. Sometimes it's easier to recognize contempt when somebody is feeling contempt and expressing contempt toward you. Think about how you feel when you're communicating with somebody who you sense or you feel is looking down on you, who is seeing you somehow as not good enough, as less than. You know what I'm talking about, right? That's contempt. Contempt is judgment, but with a negative value attached to it. When we feel contempt, that means we've placed ourselves in a position of moral superiority. And the flip side of contempt is shame. Notice when you're feeling shame. That's when you feel that you're in a position of inferiority. You feel like you're not good enough. Pay attention to this. Shame means you're not feeling that the other is honoring your dignity and that you are somehow judging your own self as being less than. When you feel shame, this is an indication that you are believing in a myth, the myth of a hierarchy of moral worth. Both of these are indications that you are believing in the myth. To develop self-awareness, you need to develop your inner observer. Your inner observer is the part of you that is always there, that is observing what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing with compassion and without judgment. It's always there. It's just that we often don't realize it's there because we haven't developed it as a muscle enough. We haven't developed a practice of recognizing it. To develop your inner observer, pause during the day. Set your alarm to go off 2, 3, 4 times a day and stop for a minute. And ask yourself, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What do I need right now to feel like I'm more self-connected? That's it. That's the practice. Don't judge your thoughts. Don't judge your feelings. Just notice them. Anybody who meditates knows exactly what I'm talking about. Central to relational literacy is learning effective communication. Communication is the primary way we relate. It's the main way that we relate. One tip that you can apply immediately is, as Rumi, I think this actually quote came from Rumi, said, is to ask yourself, is what is being communicated from me or the other, is it true? And is it kind? Make these the 2 criteria that you adhere to before sharing a communication. And if somebody is communicating with you, ask yourself this. We have, and we will be putting more resources up at veganadvocacy.org, and I talk a lot about communication in my books, actually. And finally, developing relational literacy also helps us to develop mindfulness, and vice versa. Becoming more mindful helps us become more relationally literate. Mindfulness is it's the practice and the experience of being more present, more in the moment, more self-connected, more connected with others. Mindfulness is actually the true opposite of powerarchy. There are many people in the world who have lived over thousands of years who are much wiser than I am, who have said that practicing mindfulness is the single most important practice any human being can undertake, and I actually believe them. The more mindful we are, automatically the less powerarchical we are. There are lots of resources for cultivating mindfulness. Just Google it. Many things will come up. There are great apps out there. One I recommend is Headspace. Go to headspace.com. It's free for 10 days, and then I think it's like 10 euros a month. And this helps you practice, it helps you meditate and practice mindfulness. 10 minutes a day can even make a difference. It is so important for those of us who are working for social change to understand powerarchy. We need to make our movements a safe space. And right now I'm talking in particular about the vegan movement. This applies to all movements. We need to make our movement a safe space, a space where dignity is honored, where we practice integrity, even as we might disagree about tactics and about ideologies and many other issues. We need to stop fighting each other and to commit to healthy relating. If we don't do this, we can easily end up cannibalizing ourselves. We need to remember that we are all part of something that's greater than our individual selves. We are part of a social justice movement, which I believe will be one of the most transformational movements in history. Will be looked back upon one day as one of the most transformational movements in history. This is something to be incredibly proud of. It's something to feel incredibly good about. It's a challenge to do the work we do, and it's also a really important and empowering decision that we have all made. I really believe that if we can commit to relating healthfully, we can make this movement and other movements as well the most powerful force that it can be for animals and also for the world. Thank you very much. Thank you.